On the 6th of June, 1944, the largest seaborne invasion in human history would occur. An assault from land, sea, and air would take place using forces from almost every Allied nation. On that day, the 1st Infantry Division would be assaulting Omaha Beach. But they wouldn't be alone. Tanks from the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions would be providing support for them. But that day, for the 741st Tank Battalion, the sea would be a much deadlier opponent than the German guns. By day's end, only 3 of the division's 54 tanks would go unscathed, and 27 of her 32 new duplex-drive Shermans would be lost at sea, destroyed before they even touched the shores of Normandy. By 1944, the war was in full swing. The battle for North Africa was won. With the capitulation of Italy in September of 1943, the fight for the Mediterranean was all but won. But the war was far from over. In the Pacific, the fanatical Japanese were on the back foot, but were fighting for every foot of land with horrifying ferocity. On the Eastern Front, the Russians were pushing back the German juggernaut, but not without tremendous losses on both sides, numbering in the millions. The necessity to open up another front to hasten the defeat of the Third Reich was paramount. But it would not be easy. Less than 2 years prior, on the 19th of August of 1942, the Allies would make their first probe and attempt at Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Dieppe raid was an Allied assault on a perceived weak portion of the Atlantic Wall. The raid in northern France was a combined assault of around 6,050 men, mostly Canadian troops. The assault, codenamed Operation Jubilee, was to test the viability of an amphibious invasion of Western Europe, and an attempt to gather vital intel. It would involve air cover from numerous RAF aircraft, a naval bombardment, then an amphibious landing of troops, as well as 30 of the newest British Churchill Mark I and Mark III heavy tanks. But the raid was a massive failure. The German resistance was far stiffer and more numerous than they anticipated, quickly overwhelming the Allied forces. Within 10 hours, over 3,000 Allied troops were killed, over 100 aircraft were lost, and of the 29 Churchill tanks that made it ashore, not a single one would make it back to England. The raid was a tactical failure, but according to Winston Churchill, the loss was necessary in exchange for the intelligence earned. An issue became abundantly clear: the need to find a way to get tanks safely ashore to support the infantry. During Operation Jubilee, 2 of the Churchills got drowned in deep water. Another 12 got stuck on the beach. Clearly a design needed to be made. This fell upon Nicholas Straussler, a Hungarian man who immigrated to England. He had a passion for amphibious vehicles. By 1940, he had developed a prototype of the duplex drive, based upon a Tetrarch light tank chassis. He tested it in June of 1941 in a reservoir to the satisfaction of the British Army. Immediately, several of the vehicles were made utilizing the British Valentine tank. But these vehicles never saw frontline service. Instead, they were used for training. The main chassis used for the duplex drives were the M4 Sherman. The medium tank M4 was the workhorse of the U.S. Army during World War II. The vehicle was designed in 1940 and put into service in 1942. The 33-ton vehicle was reasonably fast and well-armored and featured a potent 75mm gun, great for infantry support and hammering fixed positions and guns. Over its service life, the Sherman developed several upgrades and variants. Nearly 50,000 vehicles were built over the tank's service life. One of these variants was the Sherman Duplex Drive, or the Sherman DD. The duplex drive utilized the Sherman's hull, sealing off the lower hull and welding on a small deck around the upper portion of the hull. Affixed to this deck was a canvas screen. The screen had inflatable tubes and metal bracings to create a makeshift hull to increase the tank's buoyancy. This screen could be inflated in about 15 minutes and allow the tank to float in water with around 3 feet of freeboard. The matter of locomotion fell upon 2 brass screws located at the stern of the tank. An issue came about of powering the screws, seeing as the tank's gearbox and drive wheels were located at the bow of the tank. So instead, the rear sprocket was fitted with a drive shaft connected to a 90-degree gearbox that rotated the props. So therefore, the motion of the tracks themselves would drive the propellers. Maneuvering the tank could either be done using a hydraulic tiller located inside the tank next to the driver, or done by a tiller bar sticking up from the rear of the tank to a platform on the after part of the turret, so the commander could see over the raised skirt and drive. In the water, the Shermans appeared to be normal canvas-walled boats, easily mistaken for landing craft from a distance, as it chugged along at 4 knots. Not an incredible speed, but fast enough for a 33-ton tank. While the skirt took minutes to inflate, they took only seconds to drop, allowing the M4's deadly 75mm to be brought into the fight as soon as she hit land. These, alongside the Shermans equipped with deep wading gear, would be exactly what the Allies would need to provide tank support for the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. While the wading Shermans did play an equally large role in the invasion, I won't be covering them, seeing as I'm already towing the line of what feasibly could be considered a maritime horror with the DD Shermans. Wading Shermans are even less close to being boats. The British, Canadian, and US forces trained with the duplex-drive Valentine and Sherman tanks for months, finding the vehicles could swim very effectively in smaller seas. They, however, didn't receive much, if any, training in handling them in heavier seas. On June 3rd, the vehicles were loaded onto LSTs and shipped out for Normandy. A force of 6,000 Allied ships flooded the channel. A force of 156,000 troops were to be landed on the morning of June 6 on 5 beachheads: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. On the American beachhead of Omaha, 34,000 Americans in the 29th and 1st Infantry Divisions. They would be supported by the 743rd and 741st Tank Battalions, with DD Shermans, wading Shermans, and dozer blade-equipped Shermans. A massive aerial and naval bombardment pummeled the shore, trying to shake and dislodge the German defenders. Firing on the shore and bombing the bunkers for nearly half an hour, the landing craft moved within range. But for reasons unknown, the 741st made the decision to launch at 6,000 yards out to sea, nearly 3 nautical miles, much farther than they had trained for. On top of that, the seas that day were far from glass. Waves ran as high as 3 to 5 feet. 29 duplex-drive Shermans launched out of the battalion's 32. The other 3 staying on board the LST due to being unable to lower the ramp. The vehicles pointed toward shore, skirts inflated. Accounts indicate the crews preferred to stay on deck during the tank's swim, the only individual that had to stay in the hull being the driver. But it didn't take long before the first tank went down, the waves overpowering the side skirts. Water downfilled into the hull of the tank, increasing its weight and decreasing its buoyancy. With its buoyancy decreasing, water would fill in faster, until the 33-ton tank sank like a stone, the crew having to scramble into the water, and the driver having the difficult task of egressing the tank as it filled with water. Another tank sank, then another. The vehicles sank quickly, one after another. Only 2 of the launched DD Shermans managed to make it to shore. Their commanders, reportedly hobbyist sailors, who turned into the swells to guide their tanks safely to shore, if not way off target for their intended beachheads. The remainder of the 741st tanks had to be landed using LSTs. In comparison, the 743rd moved in far closer before launching their tanks. They only ended up losing 6 tanks into the sea. But the 741st still provided crucial gunfire support for the landing troops. Sergeant Kenneth V. Williams' wading Sherman was dropped on the beach and immediately engaged an anti-tank gun. The German gun struck their tank, injuring the sergeant, who ignored the wound, fighting on. The tank destroyed the emplacement, utilizing its 75mm main gun. Moving on, the vehicle encountered several infantrymen who were pinned down by machine gun fire. The M4 destroyed several machine gun nests before being damaged and disabled by a mine. Still wounded, Sergeant Williams continued to utilize the tank's weapon systems to assist the infantry pushing up the beach. He refused to be evacuated until the following day. His actions earned him a Silver Star. Private First Class Lawrence Sweeney's tank was hit shortly after reaching the beach. The vehicle took several hits before the commander ordered the vehicle to be abandoned. However, PFC Sweeney stayed behind to expend the remainder of the tank's ammo. After doing so, he was tasked with finding a way off the beach, which he did so while under fire. While searching for a way out, he came across a group of infantrymen pinned down by German MG fire. He mounted an abandoned M4 and utilized the tank's guns to destroy several enemy emplacements. after which he assisted in carrying and moving wounded men. For his actions, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The few vehicles that reached the beach provided invaluable support, despite losing the vast majority of the duplex-drive Shermans. But were the DD Shermans a failure? Not in the slightest. In fact, the vast majority on all the other beachheads made it to shore. It was simply the mistake of launching the vehicles too far out. The DD Shermans would be used throughout the rest of the conflict, even famously being used to cross the Rhine River in Germany. They were used well into the 50s, and the design even stayed in use well after that on other armored vehicles, as late as the 1980s on the Bradley fighting vehicles. By the end of the day, there were only 3 unscathed tanks in the 741st. Every other vehicle was either disabled or damaged or destroyed and sunk outright. 45 men were killed and another 60 wounded, which pales in comparison to the 2,400 casualties on Omaha Beach that day. But that number would have likely been much higher without the tanks of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions. The battalions recouped their losses and pushed in to help liberate Europe, staying in action until the end of the war in 1945. I'd like to thank the researchers at World War II Armor for assisting with this video. As a World War II enthusiast and reenactor, I've encountered these guys and gals a few times, and every interaction has been spectacular. As soon as I brought up the 741st and 743rd, they completely inundated me with research material, and made researching this video an absolute breeze. They are by far one of the leading experts in American armored history. Not only do they research the vehicles, they run and maintain them as well. I'll link their social media in the description below, and if you ever find yourself in the Florida area, see if they're going to any of the events nearby. They are truly a sight to behold. Fair winds and following seas, shipmates.